The night started like any other. Jake leaned back in his rickety chair on the porch, sipping a beer and listening to the crickets. The old dog by his feet barked once, then whined, as a fiery streak lit up the sky. "What the hell?" he muttered, bolting upright. The streak arced, sputtered, and crashed into the far field with a distant but resounding thud. Jake grabbed a flashlight, hopped into his beat-up truck, and sped toward the source. The field looked like something out of a sci-fi movie. A smoldering crater replaced his cornfield, glowing faintly green. Smoke rose from a metallic, pod-like object lodged in the earth. Jake killed the engine and approached cautiously, heart hammering in his chest. "Hello?" he called, though his voice sounded shaky even to him. The pod hissed, a panel sliding open with a sharp click. Jake stumbled back as a figure emerged, a tall, lithe woman with silver-blue skin, glowing eyes, and hair that shimmered like liquid starlight. "Stay back!" Jake shouted, pointing the flashlight like it was a weapon. The woman's gaze fixed on him, unblinking. Her body was wrapped in what looked like some sort of suit, though it was tattered and sparking at random points, leaving her shoulders and legs exposed. She held up a strange, orb-like device, which began whirring ominously. "No harm," she said in a halting, accented voice. "Need habitat. Survival critical." Jake blinked. "Habitat? Lady, this ain't a hotel. You're standing in my cornfield." The orb emitted a soft hum, then a bright pulse. Jake felt a strange warmth wash over him, and his skin tingled. The alien woman's eyes widened as she stared at him. "It worked," she murmured, her voice softer now. "You are my home." Jake stared at her, stunned. "What did you just say?" She didn't answer. Instead, the orb let out another pulse, and suddenly, Jake felt a magnetic pull toward her, like gravity had shifted. He stumbled forward, stopping just short of her. "What the hell was that?" he demanded, trying to back away. "You are my home now," she said, her tone almost reverent. "This device binds me to a safe habitat. Your presence stabilizes my system. Without it, I perish." Jake raised his hands. "Whoa, whoa, whoa. I didn't sign up for this. Can't you, I don't know, bind to a tree or something?" She tilted her head, clearly confused. "Trees do not emit life force. You do. Optimal match. Lady, I'm a farmer, not a life force donor." She blinked slowly, then took a step closer, inspecting him as though he were a puzzle she couldn't quite figure out. Jake took a step back, only to trip over a rock and land flat on his back. The alien crouched beside him, holding the orb over his chest. "Heartbeat strong. Vitals stable. You will suffice." "Suffice?" Jake sputtered, scrambling to sit up. "Look, you've got the wrong guy. I'm just a regular guy with a barn full of tools and a truck that barely runs." Her glowing eyes narrowed. "Barn? This is your shelter? It's not for rent," he snapped, but she was already standing, looking toward the distant structure. The orb pulsed again, and the air around them seemed to shimmer. Jake felt his stomach flip as the ground beneath them vibrated. "Hey, wait! What are you?" But she was already walking toward the barn, her suit sparking with each step. Jake scrambled to his feet, chasing after her. "You can't just, this is private property." The barn door creaked as she pushed it open, stepping inside. Jake followed, out of breath and out of patience. "This will suffice," she said, surveying the space. "For what?" She turned to him, her expression softening. "To survive. To thrive. This is my new habitat. You are my core. It is done." Jake opened his mouth to argue, but before he could, the orb in her hand emitted one final pulse. The entire barn lit up in a radiant green glow, and the walls began to shift, sprouting strange, glowing vines and pulsating orbs of light. "Oh, hell no!" Jake muttered. The alien woman turned to him, a faint smile on her lips. "You are my home now, human," she murmured, almost to herself. Jake stared at her, dumbfounded. "Lady, you've got a hell of a way of saying thanks." For the first time, she seemed to notice his expression. Her smile faltered. You heard that? Every word. She blinked, then straightened. Good. Then you understand. No, Jake said, pinching the bridge of his nose. No, I don't understand a damn thing. Well, she said, her tone almost cheerful now. You'll learn. Jake groaned. This is gonna be a long night. The next morning, Jake woke to the sound of something crashing in the barn. He groaned, pulling himself out of bed and trudging outside. The barn door was slightly ajar, and a faint green glow seeped out. Great! What now? He muttered, stepping inside. What greeted him made him freeze. The interior of the barn no longer looked like the dusty, practical space he knew. Bioluminescent plants sprouted from the rafters, tendrils hanging down like glowing vines. The air was humid, filled with the faint scent of something floral and alien. In the middle of it all stood Zalara, fiddling with what used to be his tractor. Hey! What are you doing to my equipment? Jake shouted, rushing forward. Zalara glanced up, her silver-blue skin gleaming under the alien light. Improvement, she said matter-of-factly, gesturing to a panel she'd installed on the side of the tractor. Primitive technology requires enhancement. That's not enhancement. That's my tractor, Jake snapped, waving his arms. You can't just. Habitat integration is necessary, Zalara interrupted, as if his protests were irrelevant. The structure was insufficient. This unit provides stabilization. Jake pinched the bridge of his nose. Lady, you can't just turn my barn into whatever this is. I've got work to do, you know. She tilted her head, studying him with a curious expression. You are displeased? Displeased? I'm pissed. You're turning my whole life upside down. Zalara blinked slowly, processing his words. Then, as if deciding to switch tactics, she stepped closer, her tone softening. Your contribution is vital. Without this, I cannot survive. Jake tried to hold on to his frustration, but the way she looked at him, her glowing eyes wide, her voice tinged with vulnerability, made it harder. He sighed. Fine. But stop messing with my stuff without asking. Understood, she said, though her tone made it clear she didn't fully grasp the concept of asking permission. Jake turned to leave but paused as he noticed something glowing behind a stack of hay bales. He moved closer, pulling one bale aside, and nearly dropped it when he saw what was underneath, a strange, pulsating orb embedded in the floor. What the hell is this? Energy conduit, Zalara said casually, walking over. Essential for habitat maintenance. It converts local materials. Local materials? Like what? Jake asked warily. She gestured toward the ground. Organic matter. In this case, crops. My crops? Jake's voice rose, and he pointed toward the glowing plants hanging from the rafters. So you're telling me my corn is fueling this alien jungle? Zalara nodded, her expression serene. Correct. Your crops have excellent energy density. Jake threw up his hands. Unbelievable. I'm running a farm here, not a science experiment. You misunderstand, she said, stepping closer. This arrangement benefits both. You are my home. I ensure its optimization. Jake opened his mouth to argue but stopped when Zalara placed a hand on his arm. Her touch was warm, almost soothing. Your frustration is noted, she said, her tone gentle. But this is necessary for survival. I will minimize disruption. Jake shook his head. You better, because if this mess costs me my harvest, we're gonna have a serious problem. Zalara nodded solemnly. Agreement acknowledged. Despite himself, Jake couldn't help but chuckle at her overly formal response. You're something else, you know that? She tilted her head again, studying him. Clarify, something else? Never mind, he said, waving her off. But as he walked away, he couldn't shake the feeling that his life was never going to be the same again. A loud knock at the front door jolted Jake out of his thoughts. He opened it to find Mrs. Donnelly, his nosy neighbor, holding a casserole dish and wearing her usual nosy expression. "Morning, Jake! Thought I'd stop by and check on you," she chirped, her eyes already scanning past him into the house. Jake tensed. The last thing he needed was Mrs. Donnelly snooping around while Zalara was doing whatever she was doing. "I'm fine. Busy, actually. Thanks for the casserole," he said, reaching for the dish to speed up her departure. But Mrs. Donnelly didn't budge. Her gaze shifted to the barn, where faint glowing lights were visible even in daylight. "What's going on out there? You redecorating?" Yeah. Just trying something new," Jake said, his voice strained. "Experimental lighting. Real cutting-edge stuff." Mrs. Donnelly raised an eyebrow. "Looks a bit odd. You're not growing anything illegal, are you?" Before Jake could respond, a loud crash came from the barn, followed by Zalara's voice. "Jake! Assistance required immediately!" Mrs. Donnelly's eyes widened. "Who's that? You got company?" Jake forced a laugh, stepping out onto the porch to block her view. "Oh, just a friend helping out with the, renovations." "A friend, huh?" Mrs. Donnelly's tone turned sly. "Didn't know you were seeing anyone." "I'm not," Jake blurted too quickly. "She's just visiting. Temporarily." Mrs. Donnelly squinted at him, then peered around his shoulder. "Well, aren't you going to introduce me?" Jake's heart sank as he heard Zalara's footsteps approaching. He turned to see her stepping out of the barn, her usual glowing aura and tattered survival suit on full display. Mrs. Donnelly gasped. "Oh my word! Who's this exotic young lady?" Zalara tilted her head, studying Mrs. Donnelly with detached curiosity. "Is this an Earth Elder? She appears fragile." Mrs. Donnelly bristled. "Excuse me?" Jake stepped between them, sweating bullets. "She didn't mean it like that, Mrs. Donnelly. This is, Zalara. She's visiting from very far away." Zalara nodded solemnly. "I am conducting habitat integration studies. Your planet's conditions are unusual." Mrs. Donnelly blinked. "Habitat integration? Is that some newfangled science project?" "You could say that," Jake said quickly, desperate to end the conversation. Zalara, however, seemed oblivious to his panic. She stepped closer to Mrs. Donnelly, inspecting her with the same analytical intensity she'd used on Jake. "Your energy signature is minimal. Are you in decline?" Mrs. Donnelly looked scandalized. "I beg your pardon!" Jake groaned, grabbing Zalara by the arm. "Okay, that's enough science for one day. Mrs. Donnelly, thanks for stopping by." But Mrs. Donnelly wasn't done. "Now hold on a minute. If she's staying here, the whole neighborhood's going to be talking. People will start asking questions, Jake." Jake gritted his teeth. "Let them talk." Zalara leaned closer to him, her voice low but still audible. "Is she threatening our habitat? Shall I neutralize her?" Jake's eyes went wide. "No! No neutralizing anyone!" Mrs. Donnelly froze. "Neutralize? What's that supposed to mean?" "Nothing. She's just joking," Jake said, forcing a laugh that sounded more like a wheeze. "Aliens have a weird sense of humor. I mean people. Foreign people. You know what I mean." Mrs. Donnelly took a cautious step back, clearly unsettled. "Well, I'll leave you to it then." She turned on her heel and hurried down the path, muttering to herself. Jake exhaled in relief, turning to Zalara. "What the hell was that? You can't go around talking about neutralizing people." Zalara blinked, unbothered. "She was interfering with habitat security. I acted appropriately." Jake stared at her, exasperated. "You've got to learn how to blend in if you're going to stick around. No more glowing, no more talking about energy signatures, and definitely no more threats." Zalara tilted her head. "Your concerns are noted, but I must prioritize survival." "Well, so do I," Jake snapped. "And surviving around here means not drawing attention." Zalara's gaze softened slightly, and she nodded. "I will adapt." Jake sighed, rubbing his temples. "Yeah, well, you'd better. Because Mrs. Donnelly's not the only one who'll be poking around if we're not careful. Zalara's lips curved into what Jake guessed was her attempt at a smile. Your protective instincts are commendable. They enhance your suitability as a habitat. Jake groaned. I'm not your habitat. You are, Zalara said calmly, her glowing eyes locking onto his. And I will ensure our mutual survival. Jake threw his hands up. Great. Just keep a low profile, okay? Zalara nodded, though Jake wasn't convinced she understood the concept. As he trudged back toward the house, he couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning of his problems. Jake's truck rumbled down the dirt road, loaded with supplies he hoped would help him deal with whatever Zalara had done to the barn. He glanced at her sitting in the passenger seat, looking far too comfortable in her makeshift earth attire, a mismatched combination of his old flannel shirt and a pair of gym shorts she'd found. You can't just tell people they have minimal energy signatures, he said, breaking the silence. Zalara looked at him, confused. It is accurate. Her energy output is weak. Yeah, well, humans don't talk about each other like that. It's rude. Rude? Zalara repeated, tilting her head. This concept is unfamiliar. Jake sighed, gripping the steering wheel tighter. It means you say something that might hurt someone's feelings. Zalara furrowed her brow. But the data. It's not always about the data. Jake snapped, then immediately regretted it. Zalara fell silent, her expression unreadable. Jake exhaled, realizing he'd raised his voice. Look, I know this whole situation is weird for both of us. I'm just saying, try to be a little more tactful. Tactful, Zalara echoed softly, as if testing the word. When they pulled into the hardware store parking lot, Jake parked the truck and turned to her. Stay here. Don't touch anything, don't talk to anyone, and for the love of God, don't glow. Zalara raised an eyebrow. Your instructions are peculiar. Just stay put, Jake said, hopping out of the truck before she could argue. He made it halfway through grabbing supplies when a familiar voice startled him. Jake! Didn't expect to see you here. It was Paul, a local farmer and one of the few people Jake actually liked. Hey, Paul, Jake said, trying to sound casual. Paul gestured toward the truck. Who's the lady sitting in your passenger seat? New girlfriend? Jake froze. He hadn't thought about how conspicuous Zalara might be, even just sitting in the truck. Not exactly. She's staying with me for a bit. Paul smirked. Staying with you? That's a first. What's her story? Jake hesitated, scrambling for an explanation that wouldn't make him sound crazy. She's, from out of town. Way out of town. Paul gave him a knowing look. Well, good for you. About time you had some company out on that farm. Jake mumbled something noncommittal and hurried to finish his shopping. When he got back to the truck, he found Zalara standing outside, examining a lawnmower on display. Zalara, what did I say about staying in the truck? This mechanism is fascinating, she said, ignoring his tone. Jake groaned. Get back in the truck. Now. She obliged, but not before poking at a button on the lawnmower that set off a loud beep. Heads turned, and Jake felt his face heat up as he hurried to pull her away. When they were back on the road, Zalara spoke up. Your companion seemed curious about our relationship. He's not my companion, Jake muttered. He's just a neighbor. Why did you not inform him of the binding process? Jake nearly swerved off the road. Because normal people don't go around telling their neighbors they're bound to someone. Another Earth custom? Something like that, Jake grumbled. Zalara was quiet for a moment, then said, Your customs are unnecessarily complex. Jake couldn't help but laugh. Yeah, well, you're not wrong about that. Back at the farm, Jake was unloading supplies when he noticed Zalara standing in the middle of the yard, staring up at the sky. Her expression was unusually somber, and for a moment, he felt a pang of guilt for how short he'd been with her earlier. Everything okay? He asked, setting down a bag of fertilizer. She turned to him, her glowing eyes dimmer than usual. The integration is failing. Your environment, It is not enough. Jake frowned. What do you mean, not enough? You've already turned my barn into some kind of alien rainforest. What else could you possibly need? It is not the materials, she said, her voice quieter. It is the bond. The device requires emotional resonance to stabilize. Without it, I cannot remain. Jake stared at her, unsure whether to be annoyed or concerned. Emotional resonance? What does that even mean? It means connection, Zalara said, stepping closer. Genuine, mutual understanding. Without it, the habitat integration will collapse, and She trailed off, looking away. And you'll die. Jake finished for her, the weight of her words settling over him. She nodded. Yes. Jake rubbed the back of his neck, trying to process the situation. Okay, so, how do we fix it? How do we get this resonance thing working? Zalara hesitated, then looked at him with an intensity that made his stomach flip. We must deepen our bond. Share experiences. Build trust. Jake raised an eyebrow. You mean like dating? Dating? She repeated, unfamiliar with the term. You know, spending time together, getting to know each other. Jake explained, feeling a little ridiculous. That kind of thing. Zalara considered this, then nodded. Yes. That aligns with the requirements. Jake sighed. All right, fine. If it'll stop my barn from glowing and keep you alive, I guess we can try it. Her expression brightened slightly, though her version of a smile was more of a curious tilt of her lips. When do we begin? How about now? Jake said, gesturing toward the field. You can help me fix the damage your crash caused. Zalara followed him, though her attempts to assist were more disruptive than helpful. She tried to use her orb to enhance his tools, which resulted in a shovel vibrating so violently it snapped in half. She accidentally redirected water from the irrigation system, flooding part of the field. And when she attempted to lift a bag of seeds, her strength caused the bag to rip, spilling its contents everywhere. By the time they were done, Jake was covered in mud, soaked to the bone, and more frustrated than ever. Some first aid, he muttered, wiping his face with his sleeve. Zalara looked at him, her expression oddly serious. I am not yet proficient in your methods, but I am learning. Jake couldn't help but laugh, despite himself. Yeah, well, you've got a long way to go. But I guess you're trying, and that's something. For the first time, Zalara smiled, a real smile, and Jake felt a strange warmth in his chest. Maybe this crazy situation wasn't all bad. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a golden glow over the fields, Jake found himself sitting on the porch, nursing a beer. Zalara sat beside him, her glowing eyes fixed on the horizon. Despite everything, there was an odd sense of peace in the moment. You know, Jake began, breaking the silence. This isn't exactly how I imagined my week would go. Zalara tilted her head. What did you imagine? Jake chuckled. Oh, you know, fixing fences, tending to the crops, maybe arguing with Mrs. Donnelly about property lines. Nothing involving alien jungles or emotional resonance. She looked thoughtful. Your life before my arrival, did you find it fulfilling? He shrugged, taking another sip of his beer. It was simple. Predictable. Sometimes lonely, I guess. But it worked. Zalara studied him for a moment, her expression unreadable. Your loneliness, does it persist? Jake froze, caught off guard by the directness of her question. He glanced at her, debating whether to brush it off, but something in her gaze made him decide against it. Not as much, he admitted. I mean, you've turned my world upside down, sure. But it's been different. In a good way, I think. She nodded slowly, her eyes glowing faintly in the dim light. Your presence has been stabilizing for me as well. More than I anticipated. Jake smirked. So I'm not just a walking battery to you. Zalara's lips quirked upward. You are far more than that. Though your energy output remains exceptional. He laughed, the sound echoing into the quiet evening. Well, that's a compliment I never thought I'd get. They sat in companionable silence for a while, the distant chirping of crickets filling the air. Then, without warning, Zalara shifted closer, her expression uncharacteristically vulnerable. Jake, she began hesitantly. If the integration fails, if I cannot remain here, would you remember me? Jake frowned, setting his beer down. What kind of question is that? Of course I'd remember you. How could I not? She looked down, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. For my species, connection is rare. True resonance is nearly impossible. But with you, I feel something I cannot explain. Jake felt his chest tighten at her words. He reached out, placing a hand on hers. Hey, you're not going anywhere. We'll figure this out, okay? Together. Zalara met his gaze, her eyes shimmering with a mix of hope and uncertainty. Together, she echoed softly. For the first time, Jake felt a strange sense of certainty about the situation. It was crazy, sure, but maybe, just maybe, they could make it work. The moment was interrupted by a faint hum emanating from the barn. Jake sighed, standing up. Let me guess. Something's about to explode? Zalara stood as well, her expression unusually serious. The integration may be stabilizing. We must investigate. As they walked toward the barn, Jake couldn't help but smile to himself. Life might never be the same, but for the first time in a long time, he didn't mind. Because, for better or worse, he wasn't alone anymore.